I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Michael Matheny. Michael is the director of the Center for Improving the Public's Health with Informatics and professor in biomedical informatics, medicine, and biostatistics at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Over the course of his career, Michael has produced academic work on the topics of natural language processing, risk prediction modeling, and signal detection for machine learning methods. We're so grateful to have him with us today to share his perspective and his research. Michael?
Thank you. I want to first thank you, Catherine and NIHCM, for the opportunity to come present today. It's a topic that's been near and dear to my heart for many years. So let's dive right in. Next slide. Next slide. So I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose relative to any of the tools or technologies, and all of the funding I received is from the FDA, NIH, or DoD, or VA. Next slide. So to dive right in, I'm sure everyone has heard the saying that there's been, just unprecedented and tremendous growth in the volume and complexity of medical scientific data and in volume and complexity of patient data itself. But when I went around, I'm a data-driven person and being an informatician, and I went around trying to really get a good example of that for discussion. One of the things I found that was really interesting was a systematic review looking at oncology clinical trial guidelines, essentially looking at the guidelines across different cancer types. And what they found was essentially an exponential growth in both the volume of documentation, the data and information required to deliver the clinical practice guidelines, and an exponential growth in the amount of scientific knowledge and references that were required to deliver that information, which is fascinating. And I thought was a really nice concrete example. Beyond that sort of deluge of scientific information that clinical healthcare providers are responsible for and increasingly having challenges addressing, even when you take something as straightforward as a clinical practice reminder, everyone that's all patients with coronary artery disease should be on a cholesterol medicine in the statin class if possible. You look across the nation and you can see a tremendous amount of practice variability in patients that are actually receiving that, as shown on the right-hand side of this slide. And that holds true for many other conditions, such as bronchodilator therapies in patients with COPD and many others. So when facing these challenges, really, we need help in managing all of this information. Next slide. And so, it's really why we're here today, is that artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies really hold huge promise in being able to bridge some of these gaps, address some of the challenges, and help improve healthcare and healthcare delivery. And beyond just the frame of reference that I deal with primarily in my career, there's work going on in ambient AI, which is attempting to draft provider notes without providers having to type anything, using recorded information. There's basic discovery and science and drug discovery, image processing, clinical decision support, and even in rare cases, autonomous AI applications that have been given approval by the FDA to operate without physician interpretation. Next slide. So with all of this excitement and promise and opportunity, what comes with it is a challenge of too much expectations and too much hype. And in fact, the artificial intelligence community has seen prior instances where there was excitement over a technology, everyone rushed out to sort of use it, and then there were some really bad occurrences that soured the public's perception of the use of these tools, and they saw a drastic decline in use. And so what I find fascinating here is I've been watching the Gartner hype cycle over the years sort of represent this for the public. And in 2019, deep learning, machine learning, and natural language processing were all technologies that were really of high interest, a lot of investment, a lot of excitement. And you fast forward that just 4 years, and you see deep learning, machine learning, natural language processing aren't even on the graph as individual subdisciplines. And in fact, generative AI has sort of taken all of the oxygen in the room for excitement and interest in the general AI machine learning technology, even though it's still true that all of these other older technologies are still operating and have a lot of promise. Next slide. So I can't cover the waterfront, and I think each of the panelists will present their own view on things. I'm just going to give a few examples of some of the challenges that we face when we're trying to implement AI in healthcare. And the example that I like to use here is looking at the pulse oximeter. So there was a group during the pandemic that looked at critical care patients and essentially evaluated the pulse oximeter readings with the arterial blood gas, which is a reference standard to be able to detect the oxygen. And the way that artificial intelligence is used in these applications is that a red laser is sort of shown through the finger, and the wavelengths that get through the finger are measured on the other side. What they found that among Black and African American patients is that the pulse oximeter was systematically reading lower than the actual, it was reading higher than the actual oxygen levels in the blood, which gave false confidence that the patient had sufficient oxygenation when in fact a portion of them didn't, and that was significantly higher in that subpopulation. And this is largely due to the fact that the training data that was used for these pulse oximeters was largely white and Caucasian population. And it's really relevant to today's conversation because just this week, the FDA is convened an expert panel that's going through the data and information around pulse oximeters, seeking to provide guidance and recommendations around what can be done to make these more accurate across different skin tones. Next slide. And so work that we've done also to highlight not only challenges in training data, but also challenges in applying these applications and algorithms over time. We took a series of different machine learning algorithms and looked at essentially changes over time in event rates for outcomes in associations between different features in the healthcare, as well as differences in case mix changes over time that are delivered. We found that all of these algorithms were susceptible to drift and performance problems over time. Even though deep learning and neural networks were the least affected, they were still affected. And this can have significant safety events in clinical practice. Next slide. And so I can't do a presentation without generative AI. And so I think it's really important to note that ChatGPT and large language models are not immune to any of these issues. In fact, it's known that if you try to do a prompt response for these algorithms and you ask it something after the end of its training data, it has challenges inferring and providing recommendations. It's also true if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, a group looked at ChatGPT 3.5 and 4 across 8 different tasks and basically evaluating the accuracy of those tasks compared to manual validation, and found that even among 3 months of training updates to these algorithms, the accuracy among different tasks varied widely. And you can imagine when you're trying to deploy this in clinical production systems that the safety of these is going to be even more challenging for the healthcare systems and for the FDA to regulate in the setting of continuous improvement of these algorithms. And lastly, I just want to highlight that the generative AI tools have sort of rushed onto the scene, but really tens of thousands of human hours were spent doing manual labeling and reinforcement learning to remove inappropriate, bias, and derogatory responses that have enabled the gold rush that is generative AI. Next slide. And so work that we began with the National Academy that I co-led with others on the slide back in 2018 sought to sort of do an environmental scan of healthcare and artificial intelligence, provide some general recommendations and guidance around opportunities. And even though the field has moved forward at light speed since 2019 when this was published, I still think one of my favorite parts of that was a group of us that got together and made some recommendations around guidelines for best practices of implementing AI in healthcare. And we drew from multiple different disciplines: learning, health systems, implementation science, user-centered design, and human-computer interaction. And then work with Dr. Dwanka Mullen later overlaid the lens of racial justice, health equity, and ethical AI into the framework. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail for time, other than to say, I think the most important concepts are that it's really critical to understand what you want to change or what needs to be fixed, and then evaluate that in the context of the workflow, the stakeholders, the end users that are going to be affected, the patients, the caregivers. It may be that AI is not the right tool for this. And so I think one of the challenges in generative AI right now is we're using the tool, seeking use cases for the tool, when a better practice is identify the problem that you need and then apply the technologies that are needed for that to make healthcare safer and more effective. But given that if you do choose AI or machine learning technologies, you adapt it, integrate it into the system, you deploy it into production practice and monitor it and make sure it's safe. And then you do ongoing monitoring in order to prevent performance decay, also with an eye to when the tool needs to come out of service, when it's no longer relevant or the prediction itself or performance are degrading. Next slide, please. And so I'm just briefly going to go through two works that we've done in the past year with a lens towards relevance for this panel for AI and for the implementation lifecycle. This was some work that a group of us did, Dartmouth and Vanderbilt, looking at and the VA, but essentially using 20 cardiac catheterization labs in the VA as the research site. We randomized 2 interventions in intensive quality improvement coaching, as well as informatics visualization, risk adjustment dashboard that sort of surveilled the cath labs, provided machine learning based assessments of risk, along with ability to sort of view their data. Some sites received one, some sites received other, some sites received both. And at the end of the 18 months of intervention, which the sites weren't required to make any changes whatsoever, they were empowered to do whatever was right for their practice, for their workflow. We saw that the odds ratio was 0.54 for the incidence of acute kidney injury following catheterization, the significant reduction after implementation of these tools. And I think from an AI perspective, one of the coolest things about this was that a priori, Dr. Davis had developed a set of algorithms, AI algorithms, to watch the other AI algorithms that were conducting the risk adjustment, to basically monitor them for performance degradation and update them to maintain performance. We started this trial before the pandemic and went through the pandemic, and the only way that we were able to successfully complete this was because of the algorithms watching the other algorithms and maintaining the performance of the system as the trial went on. And so I was very grateful that we sort of a priori implemented that during the beginning of the trial. Next slide. And lastly, shifting from a population-based frame to a more of a provider-patient dyad frame, I have a lot of interest in precision clinical decision support, in which context-relevant information is delivered about the patient beyond just a regular clinical reminder. So this was some work that we did adapting natural language processing tools, older technologies tools, to basically summarize for people with coronary artery disease, looking at the need for a statin cholesterol medicine. If they weren't on that medicine, they basically went in, looked at all the prior tries that they gave of that medicine, any adverse events documented in the chart, why they had coronary artery disease, gave the providers information about where to find all of that information and recommendations on what to do. We injected that directly into the electronic health record for the primary care providers. Essentially, we tried to do that per their wishes right before the primary care clinical encounter in order to sort of be appropriate with the workflow. I mean, what we saw was that if that was done properly, 1 in 10 reminders resulted in an increased statin, a renewal or start. And as you can see in the bottom, it was much preferred if it was done right before the encounter. There were situations where we had to give that information in between encounters, and because that wasn't as aligned with the workflow, there were challenges therein. And so, the other thing I would say in conclusion is I think large language models have the capacity to summarize, conduct information synthesis, and summarize care in a way that will allow this sort of work that took years to put together much more scalability and deployability. So next slide. So I thank you very much for your time. Next slide. I'm happy to answer questions at the end, and I'll pass it to the next panelist. Thank you.